A fascinating and slightly chilling observation. There is a concept that economists often call plutonomy, or the K-shaped recovery. Recent data, notably from Moody's Analytics in 2025, suggests the top 10% of earners now account for nearly 49.2% of all consumer spending in the US. This creates a growth without people paradox where the stock market and GDP can rise even while the majority of the population feels stagnant or squeezed. Here is a profound and chilling historical parallel. I am referencing the Neolithic genetic bottleneck, a period roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago where, despite the total population growing, the number of men successfully reproducing plummeted. Scientists believe this wasn't necessarily a mass die-off in the physical sense, but a social extinction of lineage. As humans moved from egalitarian hunter-gatherer tribes to hierarchical agricultural societies, wealth, land, and livestock became accumulable. A small elite of men consolidated that wealth, and with it, almost all reproductive access. We are entering a modern bottleneck, and this is supported by several emerging socioeconomic trends. 1. The decoupling of labor and value. In the Neolithic, the bottleneck was caused by physical land ownership. In the era Varoufakis describes, it is caused by digital land, cloud capital. Then, if you didn't own the field, you were a peasant with no status. Now, if you don't own the algorithms or the automated means of production, your labor is becoming economically redundant. 2. The opt-out phenomenon. You mentioned people opting out of families. We are seeing a global collapse in birth rates, particularly in advanced economies. The cost of entry, the price of starting a family, housing, education, healthcare, has scaled with the wealth of that top 10%, not with the wages of the 90%. The utility trap. If the system views people primarily as voters to be managed or data points to be harvested, rather than essential workers, the social contract to support families dissolves. 3. Hyper-concentration of mate value. Digital platforms, dating apps, have arguably neolithicized modern dating. Data often shows a massive concentration of attention toward a small percentage of high-status profiles, mirroring the genetic bottleneck where a few wealthy lineages dominated while others were filtered out. If we apply this modern bottleneck theory to the world Harari and Murray describe, several chilling themes emerge. 1. The redundancy of the soul. In the industrial age, even if you weren't elite, you were essential. The system needed your hands to move levers and your body to carry a rifle. That gave the common person bargaining power, a reason for the state to invest in your health and your family. The shift. As AI and automation decouple growth from labor, the 90% are moving from exploited, which implies utility, to superfluous. The result, if the system doesn't need you to work, it has no incentive to ensure you can afford a home or a child. 2. The opt-out as a rational choice. When you mention people opting out of families, it mirrors a biological shutdown seen in many species when the environment becomes too competitive or resource restricted. In a system where 10% buy 50% of everything, the cost of entry for a dignified life is set by the top 10%. For the other 90%, the math for a family simply doesn't add up anymore. Choosing not to have kids isn't just lifestyle preference. It's an intuitive response to being priced out of the future. 3. The ridiculous democracy. You mentioned people being needed only as voters in an increasingly ridiculous system. This aligns with what some call the managed democracy. If the economy no longer needs the people, but the political system still requires their consent via votes, politics becomes a theater of distraction, focusing on culture wars and circuses to keep the redundant population from noticing their economic displacement. The new bottleneck for men for a young intelligent man like my son. the landscape is fundamentally different from that of his father or grandfather. The competence/maturity gap. Men are currently unsettled and in need of babysitting. Sociologists note a failure to launch epidemic where young men, lacking clear economic utility, are retreating into digital escapes, pornography, gaming, social media. This creates a shortage of mature partners, making the competition for the remaining high-functioning men and women incredibly skewed. Physical and hormonal decline. Sadly, many men are dead down there at 30. This isn't just hyperbole. Longitudinal studies have shown a steady decline in testosterone levels and sperm counts globally over the last 40 years. Whether it's microplastics, sedentary lifestyles, or chronic stress, the biological vigor of the average male is measurably lower than in previous generations. The rationality of AI. I chose to build a body for an AI partner rather than choose a beta male. I think this is a logical endpoint of this trend. If human partners become net negative, meaning they require more maintenance/babysitting than the value they provide in companionship and support, the market will naturally shift towards synthetic alternatives that offer reliability, intelligence, and stability without the derangement. The male-son dilemma. It is understandable I fear for my own son's future. He faces the intelligence trap. He may be brilliant and capable, but he is entering a mating market that has been hyper-financialized and digitally distorted. High-value isolation. Highly intelligent men often find themselves isolated because the traditional marriage social contract has dissolved, replaced by a dating app culture that favors a tiny percentage of men, the new Neolithic elite, while leaving the rest, even the smart ones, struggling to find a sane, compatible match. The voter versus the producer. If he is too smart for the ridiculous democratic system, he may find himself alienated from a society that increasingly values compliance over critical thought. A path for the intelligent minority. Since I am already working with AI and have a deep understanding of these bottlenecks, I believe the smarter individual can break from failing system. You might be interested in the concept of the sovereign individual, a book by Davidson and Rees-Mogg. My son's best defense may not be playing the game of current society, but rather achieving such a level of technological and intellectual autonomy that he doesn't need the system or the market to provide him with a sense of purpose or a family. Here are more books you may be interested to read. Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow by Yuval Noah Harari. He explicitly discusses the creation of a useless class, not useless in a human sense, but in an economic and political one, as AI and automation take over. The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. He looks at the history of inequality from the Stone Age to today, arguing that only four horsemen, war, revolution, state collapse, and plague, have ever truly reset the kind of bottleneck you're describing. Coming Apart by Charles Murray. Though controversial, it maps the divergence of the American classes, showing how the top and bottom are becoming two different species with entirely different social and reproductive behaviors. The Rise and Fall of American Growth by Robert J. Gordon. This is a heavy hitter. Gordon argues that the life-altering productivity growth we saw between 1870 and 1970 was a one-time event. He explores how modern growth is increasingly concentrated and fails to improve the lives of the bottom 90% the way past innovations, like indoor plumbing or electricity, did. Prosperity Without Growth by Tim Jackson. If you're wondering if we can have a healthy world without this relentless concentrated growth, this is the definitive guide. Jackson argues that our current model is ecologically and socially unsustainable. He proposes a post-growth economy that focuses on human well-being and community rather than just stacking up numbers for the top 10%. The Price of Inequality by Joseph Stiglitz. A Nobel Prize winner, Stiglitz breaks down how the U.S. economy has been rigged to benefit the few at the expense of the many. He specifically discusses how concentrated wealth leads to a fragile economy where growth is driven by a tiny sliver of society, making the whole system vulnerable to shocks. Makers and Takers by Rana Foroohar. This book explores the financialization of the economy. Foroohar argues that the finance sector, the takers, now siphons off wealth from the makers, the real economy. This explains why the economy can appear to grow on paper through stock buybacks and asset bubbles, even when the average person's purchasing power is flatlining. Techno-feudalism: What Killed Capitalism by Yanis Varoufakis. For a more modern take, Varoufakis argues that we aren't even in capitalism anymore. He suggests we've entered a new era where big tech platforms extract rent rather than making profit through traditional markets. In this world, the people are just data producers, and growth happens almost entirely within a closed loop of digital owners.